The rain had begun before the carriage reached the gates, a thin, needling drizzle that darkened the cobbles and dulled the gilt of the family crest, as though even the heavens wished to temper celebration with restraint. Inside, the newly made Marchioness sat upright, her gloved hands folded with ceremonial precision in her lap, her expression composed enough to satisfy any onlooker, though her heart still beat with the echo of vows spoken only hours before. She was young, but not naive, hopeful, but not foolish. Marriage, she knew, was rarely the province of romance among her rank. Yet she had permitted herself the smallest indulgence of expectation, that courtesy might soften into kindness, that duty might one day resemble affection. Her husband did not look at her as the carriage slowed. The Marquis of Ashcombe stared instead through the rain-streaked window, his profile carved by lamplight and reserve. He was a man trained from birth to master himself, to prize composure over comfort, command over confession. His title was ancient, his estates vast, his expression habitually unreadable. Those who knew him best said he was honorable. Those who knew him little said he was cold. Both were correct, and neither prepared her for what would follow. Ashcombe House rose before them, severe and symmetrical, its many windows glowing faintly like distant, watchful eyes. Servants hurried forward, doors opened, and the world seemed suddenly to remember its expectations. He offered his arm, she accepted. They crossed the threshold as one might cross a border, aware that life on the other side would demand new rules, new silences. The household bowed, the butler announced them, and the echoes of their names travelled up the stone walls, grand and hollow in equal measure. It was not until much later, when the house had settled and the candles burned lower, that he finally spoke the words that would define them. They stood in a chamber prepared with all the symbols of union, flowers arranged with care, a fire laid ready, the air heavy with the perfume of ceremony. He removed his gloves with deliberate calm, as though preparing for a negotiation rather than a confession. She waited, spine straight, eyes attentive, every lesson of decorum holding her steady. "You must understand me clearly," he said at last, his voice even, unsoftened by the intimacy of the hour. "This marriage was necessary. It was never intended to be complete." He met her gaze then, and there was no cruelty in his eyes, only distance. "You will never be my true wife." The sentence fell between them like a door closing. For a moment, the fire crackled too loudly, the silence almost impolite. She felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate, yet something within her refused the luxury of collapse. She inclined her head, just enough to acknowledge receipt of a truth delivered without ornament. "I see," she replied, and nothing more. He seemed faintly unsettled by her composure, though he masked it quickly. Explanations followed, carefully phrased, rooted in obligation and legacy, in expectations older than either of them. She listened as she had been taught, without interruption, without visible injury. When he finished, she thanked him for his candor, wished him a restful night, and withdrew with quiet dignity, leaving him alone amid the trappings of a union he had already hollowed. By morning, the house knew. Such knowledge did not travel by words alone. It lived in absence, in the careful spaces left between husband and wife at breakfast, in the way doors were held and then released. She took her seat at the table with measured grace, addressed the servants kindly, and spoke only when addressed. He arrived late, departed early, and treated her with impeccable politeness, which somehow wounded more than neglect. Society, ever alert to imbalance, sensed the fracture almost at once. At their first appearance together, she entered on his arm and left alone. Fans fluttered. Eyebrows rose. Whispers threaded themselves through drawing rooms like embroidery stitched by unseen hands. She was pitied, admired, and assessed in equal measure. He was watched. The Marchioness bore it all with a serenity that surprised even herself. If she had been denied affection, she would not be denied purpose. She rose early, learned the rhythms of the estate, studied ledgers by firelight, and spoke with tenants who had never expected a titled lady to listen. She asked questions. She remembered names. Her voice, when raised, was calm, and therefore impossible to dismiss. Ashcombe observed these changes from a distance he had chosen, unaware at first of their consequence. The estate prospered quietly. Complaints lessened. Gratitude grew. And slowly, imperceptibly, the household's loyalty shifted, not through rebellion, but through respect. One evening, as he watched her cross the hall surrounded by soft acclaim not meant for him, the Marquis felt something unfamiliar stir, unease edged with the first hint of regret. He had commanded obedience and received excellence, yet found himself curiously diminished by it. The woman he had declared unimportant was becoming indispensable, and the realization arrived too late to dismiss. She, meanwhile, retired that night with the same composed expression she wore each day, though alone she allowed herself a single, steady breath. She had been wounded, yes, but not undone. If she could not be cherished, she would be unassailable. And in that resolve, quiet and absolute, the balance between them began, irrevocably, to change. In the weeks that followed, the Marchioness moved through Ashcombe House as though she had always belonged to it, her presence neither tentative nor ostentatious, but assured in a way that required no announcement. She learned the household routines with quiet efficiency, memorized names, and corrected nothing publicly, choosing instead to speak gently and privately, which earned her more obedience than severity ever could. Servants who had braced themselves for hauteur found instead a mistress who noticed small failures and smaller kindnesses, and who thanked them for both. Her courtesy was precise, never indulgent, yet it carried weight, for it was offered without condescension. The Marquis observed this from afar, content at first to allow the domestic sphere to occupy her energies while he returned to the concerns he considered substantial. He attended meetings, managed correspondence, and received guests, assuming the household's improved order was the natural result of newly imposed authority. It did not occur to him that authority could be exercised without command, nor that influence might grow most powerful when it appeared effortless. When reports reached him of smoother operations and fewer grievances, he accepted the credit without inquiry, unaware that it rested on foundations he had neither laid nor tended. Her refusal of his offerings came quietly, without drama or accusation. A jewel case sent to her rooms returned unopened, accompanied by a note expressing gratitude but no need. Invitations declined were phrased with such careful courtesy that no fault could be found in them. She dined when required, conversed when addressed, and withdrew when the hour permitted, never pressing for attention, never seeking proximity. The restraint of her conduct unsettled him more than any display of resentment might have done, for it left him without an offense to correct. Beyond the walls of the house, the estate itself began to change in ways subtle but unmistakable. She took an interest in the cottages at the edge of the land, listened to the tenants' concerns regarding repairs and harvests, and spoke to the steward with informed questions that revealed a keen understanding of figures and fairness alike. Improvements were modest but effective, undertaken without flourish, and the gratitude they inspired was sincere. Word spread slowly, carried by those who had no reason to flatter and no expectation of reward. At a small gathering hosted by a neighboring family, the shift became visible. The Marchioness was seated among older ladies who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and approval, and when she spoke, the room inclined toward her voice. Compliments were offered not on her appearance, though she was elegant, but on her intelligence and composure. The Marquis, standing apart, found himself listening as others praised his wife's discernment, her kindness, her steadiness. Each commendation felt oddly misplaced, as though directed toward something that should have belonged to him but did not. Society, ever alert to nuance, noted the imbalance. Fans paused mid-motion, glances lingered, and a new narrative took shape, whispered and embroidered with care. The Marchioness was admired for her dignity. The Marquis was regarded with a curiosity edged by quiet reproach. No accusation was spoken aloud, yet the absence of warmth between them became a subject of speculation, and speculation, once loosed, was impossible to recall. He found himself the object of scrutiny not because of any scandalous act, but because of what he conspicuously withheld. Still, she did not alter her course. Her days were full, her evenings reserved, her manner unwavering. She did not seek allies, yet allies found her. Clergymen praised her discretion, tenants her fairness, visiting relatives her impeccable conduct. Each approval added to a reputation she neither claimed nor resisted, and the effect was cumulative, like water wearing smooth a stone. The household began to look to her instinctively for guidance, and even those loyal to the Marquis deferred when she spoke, sensing that her judgment was both measured and just. One afternoon, he encountered her unexpectedly in the estate office, bent over accounts he had not realized she reviewed. She rose at once, offered him her seat, and apologized for the intrusion, though her figures were precise and her conclusions sound. He dismissed her apology with a nod, but the exchange lingered with him afterward, unsettling in its simplicity. She had not challenged him. She had merely understood his domain as well as her own. That evening, as he prepared to host a formal dinner, he learned that several guests had specifically requested her presence at table. The request was framed politely, but its implication was unmistakable. When she entered the dining room, composed and luminous in her restraint, the attention she received was immediate, and he felt, for the first time, the peculiar sensation of being peripheral in his own house. Applause was not required. Approval radiated softly, and it was not his to command. Later, alone in his study, he considered the transformation with a frown he could not quite explain. He had sought distance and received distinction, had denied intimacy and been met with excellence. The woman he had consigned to formality had made formality her strength, and in doing so had reshaped the world around her. The realization settled uneasily, for it suggested that the balance between them was no longer fixed, and that obedience, once assumed, had become something far more dangerous in its perfection. The opportunity for privacy came not by design but necessity, as so many turning points do, disguised as inconvenience rather than intention. A late autumn storm swept across the estate with unseasonable ferocity, flooding low fields and tearing branches from the old oaks that lined the drive. Messages arrived in haste, servants moved with urgency, and the Marquis found himself detained at Ashcombe House long past the hour he would ordinarily have withdrawn to London. Responsibility demanded his attention, and responsibility, at least, was something he understood. The Marchioness had been awake since dawn, overseeing preparations with quiet authority, issuing instructions that steadied the household rather than alarmed it. When reports reached her that a tenant family had been displaced by rising water, she arranged temporary shelter without fanfare, her decisions swift and practical. By evening, fatigue showed only in the faint shadow beneath her eyes, which she did not attempt to conceal. She was not performing resilience, she was living it. They encountered one another at last in the smaller sitting room adjacent to the study, a space used rarely and therefore free of ceremony. Outside, rain lashed the windows, the sound insistent enough to deny retreat. A single fire burned low, casting restless shadows across the walls. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them had become habitual, yet now it felt charged, expectant, as though the house itself had paused to listen. "You have been occupied all day," the Marquis said at last, his tone formal, almost cautious. It was not a reproach, nor quite an inquiry, but something approaching acknowledgment. "There was much to be done," she replied, inclining her head. "The storm has unsettled more than the grounds." He studied her then, perhaps for the first time without preconception. The calm precision of her manner had not wavered, yet there was a gravity to her presence that suggested endurance rather than ease. He gestured toward a chair, an invitation she accepted without hesitation, seating herself opposite him at a distance that preserved propriety while allowing conversation. It was a small thing, that acceptance, yet it altered the tenor of the room. "I am told," he continued, "that you have taken considerable initiative in matters beyond your immediate charge." The words were measured, chosen with care. "The estate speaks highly of your efforts." "I have only fulfilled my duties," she said simply. "Nothing more." "Nothing less," he returned, before he could restrain the impulse. The admission surprised them both. He paused, then added, "Your conduct has been exemplary." She regarded him steadily, neither warmed nor offended by the praise. "I endeavored to meet expectations." "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the difficulty." Her brows lifted, the smallest fraction, inviting clarification. Encouraged by the restraint of her response, he found himself speaking with an honesty that felt both foreign and overdue. He spoke of order, of legacy, of the fear of disorder that had shaped his understanding of marriage as an institution rather than a union. His words were not confessional, yet they carried the weight of long-held conviction, and when he finished, he seemed to await judgment rather than agreement. She listened without interruption, her attention unwavering. When she spoke, her voice was neither sharp nor softened, but resolute. "You told me I would never be your true wife," she said. "I believed you." He flinched, though he did not look away. "I did not imagine," she continued, "that affection would be offered later in recompense. I arranged my expectations accordingly. If I have succeeded in my role, it is because clarity, however unkind, permits preparation." The simplicity of her statement struck him with unexpected force. "You do not resent me," he said, uncertain whether he hoped the answer would be yes or no. "I do not indulge in what cannot be altered," she replied. "Resentment requires a certain faith in change." The rain intensified, drumming against the glass as though punctuating her words. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his composure fraying at the edges. "And if change were possible," he asked, "would that faith be misplaced?" She hesitated then, just long enough for the pause to matter. "It would depend," she said carefully, "on whether the change were born of understanding or merely discomfort." Her discernment unsettled him. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even relief, at the suggestion of reconsideration. Instead, she offered caution, a reminder that what he sought now might not be what she required. The realization pressed upon him with increasing clarity. She was not waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. "I find," he said slowly, "that I am less at ease than I anticipated." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Ease," she replied, "is not always the companion of truth." They sat in silence once more, the fire sinking lower, the room dimming around them. In that quiet, he understood something that had eluded him since the beginning. Authority had secured her obedience, but it had never held her heart. And now, confronted with the possibility of loss that obedience had concealed, he felt the first stirrings of a desire he could not command. When she rose to leave, excusing herself with faultless courtesy, he did not attempt to detain her. He watched as she crossed the room and disappeared into the corridor, her steps unhurried, her bearing unchanged. Only when the door closed did he acknowledge the weight of what had passed between them. He had spoken too late, and yet perhaps not too late to learn that what is freely given cannot be demanded, and what is withheld with dignity may yet be the truest measure of power. The evening chosen by circumstance rather than design arrived with deceptive calm, the air clear and cold, the house illuminated for a gathering meant to affirm stability and order. Ashcombe House received its guests with customary splendor, chandeliers casting measured light upon polished floors, the murmured conversations of rank and privilege weaving together like practiced music. The Marquis stood at the head of the room, composed as ever, fulfilling expectation with precision, yet aware of a restlessness beneath the surface that no discipline could suppress. This night, he knew, would not pass him unchanged. The Marchioness entered quietly, announced by title but already known by reputation. Heads turned not in surprise, but in acknowledgment, and a subtle shift followed her progress through the room. She wore her position with the same restraint that had come to define her, her movements unhurried, her expression serene without invitation. Those who greeted her did so with genuine warmth, and she returned their civility without excess, never seeking attention yet receiving it nonetheless. The space she occupied seemed to settle around her, as though order itself had found a center. For the first time, the Marquis did not remain apart. When he moved to her side, the gesture carried weight precisely because it was unexpected. Conversation faltered momentarily, then resumed with heightened interest, every courtesy observed, every glance noting the proximity between husband and wife. He offered his arm, not as obligation but as choice, and she accepted after a measured pause that spoke more eloquently than haste. Together they crossed the room, the quiet scrutiny of society trailing them like a held breath. Dinner passed with deliberate formality, yet beneath the ritual lay a current of anticipation. He addressed her directly, soliciting her opinion on matters he once considered solely his domain. She responded with clarity and confidence, her voice steady, her insights thoughtful. Those at table listened, not because she was a marchioness, but because she spoke with authority earned rather than assumed. The Marquis felt the weight of that distinction keenly, recognizing in it both her strength and his former blindness. When the final course was cleared and guests dispersed into smaller circles, he requested a moment alone with her. The words were unadorned, the tone respectful, and the request itself a departure from habit. She inclined her head in assent, and they withdrew to a quieter chamber where the sounds of the gathering softened into distant echoes. There, without the shelter of ceremony, he faced her fully. "I have wronged you," he said, and the admission was unqualified. "Not by cruelty, but by presumption. I mistook restraint for absence, and obedience for insignificance." She regarded him with attentive composure, neither startled nor appeased. "You were clear in your intentions," she replied. "I shaped myself accordingly." "That clarity," he said, "has cost me more than I anticipated." He paused, choosing words not to persuade but to reveal. "I believed authority sufficient. I was mistaken." Silence followed, dense but not hostile. She did not rush to fill it, allowing his confession its full measure. When she spoke, her voice was calm, yet carried an unmistakable gravity. "Affection is not restored by acknowledgment alone," she said. "Nor is trust summoned at will." "I do not ask for restoration," he answered. "Only the opportunity to earn what I dismissed." The humility of the statement marked a departure as profound as any declaration. He did not offer promises, nor did he invoke entitlement. He stood before her stripped of assumption, uncertain yet resolute. She studied him then, as she had the estate, the accounts, the people entrusted to her care, assessing not potential but truth. "Then understand this," she said. "I will not be reclaimed as something lost. I would be chosen as something valued." "I choose you," he replied, and the words, spoken without flourish, resonated more deeply than any vow. "Not as title, nor as convenience, but as my equal." The gathering beyond the walls continued, unaware that its significance had already been surpassed. When they returned together, their manner altered not by display but by alignment, an unspoken accord evident in shared glances and unforced proximity. Society observed, recalibrated, and accepted the transformation with the pragmatism it reserved for inevitabilities. In the days that followed, change manifested not in grand gestures but in constancy. He consulted her openly, deferred where she excelled, and stood beside her without overshadowing. She allowed herself to respond, cautiously at first, measuring sincerity against time. Affection did not bloom at once, but respect deepened, and from respect grew the fragile beginnings of trust. Ashcombe House settled into a new rhythm, one not dictated by command but shaped by mutual regard. The tenants noticed, the servants adjusted, and the estate flourished under a partnership forged not by romance alone, but by recognition. The Marquis learned that authority shared did not diminish him, and the Marchioness discovered that dignity preserved could still open the door to tenderness. In quiet moments, they walked the grounds together, not as symbols of reconciliation but as individuals learning one another anew. Their steps fell into easy accord, the distance once so carefully maintained now unnecessary. What had begun as a marriage of duty found its resolution not in passion reclaimed, but in understanding earned, and in that measured harmony, both found something enduring and wholly their own.